All right, folks, welcome back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. You are listening to the Dr. Louis Sandoval Show. Welcome to the clinic where we talk about our health, our spiritual health, our mental health, and our physical health. And today we are talking about how can we think like Catholics and focus on the little things in life in order to get us to heaven. You know, we sometimes want to think about doing big things. Sometimes we feel like we have to really do extraordinary things. But I was reminded the other day when I was talking to one of my kids and realizing, I don't want you to do big things in order to make me happy. It's just the simple things. You have a few little chores to do around the house. If you can just do those well, I don't have to worry about that. That gets done. And everything else kind of goes into order and really takes place well. That's what really matters. That's what's important. I think God thinks of us in the same way. You know, we're all God's children, and God gives us little chores that sometimes we think are annoying or are not exciting, or that we're not doing that big a deal by simply saying our prayers, just one rosary a day, or, you know, taking the time to fast for the day. Boy, that feels like it's a bit much. I don't know if I want to do it, but I think that if we can focus on the little things in life, if we can focus on that which is simple, boy, that's all we really need to make it to heaven. We don't really need much else. And at the end of the day, that's the end game, right? The bottom line as Catholics is we just want to make it to heaven. We want to get that sainthood. We want to be one with Christ. We want to make it through those pearly gates and say, I made it to heaven. But if we feel like we've got to do really big things to do that, then we're not thinking the way Christ thinks. Before the break, we were talking about a few gospel readings and a few Bible verses on how Jesus is saying, all I need to do is trust you with the little things so I can trust you with bigger things to come. Well, it can feel overwhelming that way. It can feel like, how do I do that? I think one of the saints that we can look at, of course, and if anybody who's ever heard of St. Teresa of Lisieux, or they called her the Little Flower, is that she followed what she called the little way. Now, remember, she was in a convent. She wasn't traveling much around the world. And she decided that the little way was her simple approach to the spiritual life. And in that way, she was going to be able to do extraordinary things with extraordinary love. We forget we have to have the level of faith, like the mustard seed that Jesus says, small level of faith. If you have the smallest level of faith, you're going to have the faith of a mustard seed. It can grow into the biggest of bushes. Or Jesus is saying, if you have even the smallest of faith, you can move mountains. I think St. Teresa is a good reminder of that. I found this nice article on her, a couple of articles I want to read on her. But just to go through and to remind us, what is that we need to do, you know, so we don't feel overwhelmed, we don't feel depressed and anxious and worried about what am I doing with my life? How am I going to make it to heaven? I haven't done this, I haven't done that. I think Jesus is reminding us, and through St. Teresa we can see that, keep it simple. If we keep it simple, we'll make it into heaven and have much bigger things. Let's read this. Let me read this article for you. It says, St. Teresa of Lisieux has become one of the most popular saints in the past 100 years, and whenever her name is brought up, so too is her little way. However, not everyone is familiar with this phrase. What is the little way? She wrote about the spiritual pathway in her autobiography, Story of a Soul. Throughout her life, St. Teresa wanted to become a saint. Yet in her eyes, her life wasn't all that extraordinary. Don't we feel that way sometimes? Like all of a sudden we have to do something super extraordinary. We have to get a bunch of college degrees, or we have to, you know, really build this big church and put our name on it and say that we built it. St. Teresa tells us a little bit different. It says she compared herself to other saints and she thought she could never reach the same heights of sanctity. This is what she wrote. You know, it has never been my desire to become a saint, but I have always felt, in comparing myself with the saints, that I am far removed from them as a grain of sand. I'm sorry, I read the first part wrong. It says, you know, it has ever been my desire, not never, ever been my desire to become a saint. So she'd always wanted to become a saint. But how many times do we do this? We look at the lives of saints and we think, boy, I could never do that. Look at everything they did. They traveled. Some of these saints became bishops, and like St. Patrick all over the island of Ireland, and, you know, all these different things. How could I ever accomplish that? Well, St. Teresa found herself in that place. And she says that she's so far removed from them as a grain of sand, which the passerby tramples underfoot, is remote from the mountain whose summit is lost in the clouds. So sometimes we think, gosh, in order to be a saint, I have to reach the highest of clouds, and how am I going to get there? She felt she was a little grain of sand far from the mountains. Then it says, the article goes on to say, instead of being discouraged, St. Teresa trusted in God and believed that it was in her littleness that she could become a saint. So I think that that's the biggest part right there. The biggest part wasn't the littleness in that sentence. It was that she trusted in God. I think that's the hardest part for us, because we feel like we think the way we think. We think God thinks the way we think. I think we need to change the way we think to the way God thinks, right? Because a lot of times this is where we see people in pitfalls. We think, oh, God thinks this or God thinks that. I'm trying to tell God or say about what God thinks based on how I think. And we got to switch it around. I got to realize God is unknowable. I don't even know how God thinks, but I can surmise certain things. I can understand certain things if I look around the world and not focus on my knowledge. But the first thing I have to do right here, like St. Therese said, she trusted in God and she believed that in her littleness, she would become a saint, meaning that I know how I think, but I'm going to trust in God, and this is the only power God gave me. He didn't put me in a big place, but he put me here in this home. I can go mow the lawn, maybe I can organize the office. Maybe I can do something like that. And in that little act, I'm going to trust that God can do big things with it if I devote myself to God. This is what she said. I concluded that God would not inspire desires which could not be realized, and that I may aspire to sanctity in spite of my littleness. For me to become great is impossible. I must bear with myself in many imperfections. And I can relate to that. And then she says, but I will seek out a means of getting to heaven by a little way, very short and very straight. A little way that is wholly new. This little way, the article says, consisted in performing little virtues, not seeking grandiose sacrifices to God, but little acts of holiness. You must practice the little virtues. This is sometimes difficult, she said, but God never refuses the first grace, courage for self-conquest. And if the soul corresponds to that grace, she at once finds herself in God's sunlight. So here we go. It's very simple. I have to first just have a desire, have the knowledge that I want to conquer myself, meaning that I want to put away all my vices. I want to put away anything that's bad. And I want to start to move in that way that I'm going to get closer to God, which means that I have to recognize my imperfections. That's what St. Therese said. She said, I must bear with myself in my imperfections, right? So we have to recognize that. That's the humility. I have to look at myself and realize I'm not perfect. I'm far from perfect. I have a lot of, shall we say, a lot of people out there email me and say I have a lot of insecurities. They have a lot of self-doubt. They have a lot of pride. Whatever it is we struggle with, we're each going to have our struggle. Am I willing to try to overcome that? Once I'm willing to try to overcome that, already we're in God's good graces. Says she finds herself, the soul finds herself in God's sunlight just by my desire to recognize I'm not perfect. I need to move forward. But now I just want to, how do I do that now? Now that I do that, what am I supposed to do? What little things can I do? The article says, frequently she would recall the image of a little child and how we should be that child, trusting in our loving Father, always striving for heaven, even when we make mistakes. Keep in mind, this doesn't say no mistakes. Sometimes, a lot of times we think, oh, saints, they were perfect. They didn't make any mistakes. No, only Jesus was perfect. The saints made mistakes. The question is, am I humble enough to recognize that I make mistakes? And in spite of my mistakes, continue to walk towards God. That's humility. To keep walking towards somebody and saying, no, I'm not perfect, but I'm going to keep trying.